record. Okay, here we are. Let me minimize this. No, I cannot minimize while I'm recording. Okay, no problem. Let me just shrink this window a little bit. Okay. I got a whole bunch of questions.
Great.
Until a few years ago, the Silicon Valley was the center of innovation and desirable things. Now, Silicon Valley bashing, in a way, has become a literary genre, of which you are the most stylish, sophisticated interpreter in this book. Also, what was the tipping point for this reversal, at least in your case?
Well, I think that I would maybe walk back the term bashing. I think that the industry is on the receiving end of a lot of criticism right now, and certainly increased scrutiny. But I think that it's the level of scrutiny that is appropriate for an industry that has so much power, such a wide reach, such a concentration of wealth and influence. And I think that there is a lot of innovation still happening in Silicon Valley. I also think that there is a lot of, I think that a lot of what's being billed as innovation is actually like quite cynical applications of consumer technologies of, I know we can get into that, sort of circumventing social issues, but I think that the tipping point, I don't think that there was any one moment in particular where people kind of woke up to this sort of overwhelming concentration of wealth and power, and I would say also recklessness or disregard for consequences. I think that people have been criticizing and critiquing technology, Silicon Valley, venture capital, capitalism for decades. I think that it's really a question of whose voice is heard and when they're heard, and what sorts of narratives take hold in the media. But I think in the United States, a lot of people sort of had a way into these questions or into this critique after the 2016 presidential election.
Yeah.
I think that in many ways, Silicon Valley has presented itself as sort of a black box, and it uses a lot of very savvy marketing language to sort of have an aura of mystique. And I think that it can be really hard to penetrate that. And something about the election, I think because so much of that story was about consumer technology like Facebook, really demystified some of these issues of power and irresponsibility or unaccountability. So it's a long-winded answer to your question. Sorry.
No, it's perfect. You didn't mention specifically Cambridge Analytica, but maybe it had a role.
Sorry?
Maybe it had a role. Cambridge Analytica played a role in this changing of attitude.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't want to overstate the sophistication of what they were doing, but I think that story certainly was an accessible narrative that helped people start thinking differently about how they were using products in their everyday lives.
Yeah.
And I mean this about like in a sort of general way, because there have been incredible critics of Silicon Valley for decades. But a lot of them are working in academia. A lot of the criticism does involve a certain amount of technical interest, I guess, And so I think that, it's one thing to say dismissively that the recommendation algorithms are ruining democracy. It's another thing to really think about how those algorithms are designed and who are the people building them and what are their politics or what's their guiding philosophy. So I do think that we're entering a phase of really strong tech criticism. And I think that I'm much more of an observer in the book. I do write more critically in my sort of journalistic life, but the book was really just sort of like trying to just articulate what I was seeing and how I was feeling, and hoping that that could be sort of like metadata for people, you know, sort of like that they could extrapolate from just what it felt like and looked like to be here at this particular time.
Definitely. Of course, you're totally right that critiques have been there for decades, but I still believe that something has changed. I don't know who to credit for that. I mean, you for one, but a couple of years ago, I came to San Francisco to interview Tristan Harris, who was already articulated. And then 4 years ago, I came to Berkeley to interview Jaron Lanier, who had the same critique that, I mean, many of the same critique that you do, even harsher maybe. But still, there were some tiny islands of critique. I mean, more intellectual from one side, maybe, I don't know. It seems to me that 2 days ago, before I had to interview you, I received a new book proposal from a former Google communication officer who resigned, who has just written a book about which kind of macho culture Google was. I mean, I don't say that every week I receive some kind of new book proposal about, but still, they are multiplying. They're multiplying, and it wasn't like that until a few years ago. But yeah, but then again, I take for the one part of your answer about the 2016 election is already a part of this. Because when I interviewed Tristan Harris, he introduced me to the distinction between the companies who relies on the attention economy model, so to speak. I mean, Facebook. I mean, they have to be addictive because the more time you spend on the platform, the more money they do, okay? Versus another model, which was the Apple model, or maybe Netflix via subscription. They charge for the telephone, they charge for the service, but they're not forced to maximize your attention in the ways that Facebook and others do. Do you think that this is a fundamental problem with the Silicon Valley ecosystem? I mean, this attention economy model?
I think that the business model that encourages it is a problem. And I do want to add that there were really wonderful tech critics in the 90s, especially. There was Ellen Ullman, there was Paulina Borsuk. There were a lot of publications that were immediately critical of the sort of hype that Wired was producing.
Yeah.
But they didn't get the sort of attention, you're right, the sort of attention or marketing or interest as books are right now. I think I'm just happened to be at the right time in the right place, but it's sort of like the wave is cresting. It definitely, has become a genre. I think that the attention economy, I mean, it's tied to the sort of rapacious data collection that I write about in my book. And, you know, I think that what is behind that, obviously, like you were saying, is the business model of needing to maximize engagement. You know, if you have an app that people are only looking at once a week, that's not considered a useful app, that's considered a failure. And that's because these are businesses that are ad supported in many ways and rely on these partnerships to keep things afloat. I think that that's certainly one model that's interesting and has a lot of problems. And we could go into that in depth if you want. But I also think that a lot of companies that don't rely on that have other troubling models, business models, such as, you know, robust government contracts with the Department of Defense. There have been a lot of internal protests at companies like Amazon and Google and the company I used to work for, GitHub, against contracts with ICE or with, I'm trying to remember what specifically, you know, at Google there was I could be getting this wrong. At Google there was a lot of dissent internally about Google designing a sort of pro-censorship
Yeah.
search engine for China.
And maybe
So,
facial recognition?
yeah, facial recognition also also a very controversial thing internally. But my point is just that there are different business models and they have different incentives, and
Yeah.
some of them are just more accessible to a consumer, because if I'm, you know, if I'm dabbling in the open source community on GitHub, I don't necessarily know that that company is in part supported financially through government contracts. This is a hypothetical, but it but you know, that's the model for a lot of these companies.
Yeah. Different business model, different problems, you say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some are more apparent to the normal user rather than others, but still, yeah.
Right.
But this is a formal question about your book. I mean, you choose not to make any names. Of course, everyone understands what is the microblogging platform, or what is the company of Seattle company that is a very trigger happy vis-a-vis of libel cases and stuff like that. I've read it in Italian, so I'm trying to make some translation. But why did you choose that way? I mean, not to make any names, in order to avoid huge judiciary problems, or because, I mean,
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. It's a stylistic decision
yeah,
for a few different reasons. I think. Um, I mean, not to be rude, but I think that the primary reason was I don't think it matters what these companies were. Not to be rude to the founders of these companies, not to be rude to the companies themselves, but in many ways, what I wanted to highlight was the way a lot of people and organizations react to structural demands, the incentives that, you know, push them to develop a product in one direction or another, have a certain type of workplace environment. And so I think that I could have worked at any number of startups at this time in Silicon Valley, and had a very similar experience. And it's also just sort of a way of you know, acknowledging that companies come and go, that these are not, you know, Silicon Valley has a very pervasive fetish for individualism.
yeah.
And so I wanted to, you know, highlight what companies were doing and what executive positions people had, rather than name them. You know, it's not a tell-all book. It's not like I didn't want it to be read as an expose of any one company. It's just not that. And as soon as you name a company, it becomes that company book. You know what I mean?
I do perfectly know what you mean, and it makes perfect sense. In fact, I've just written a book with Airbnb in the title, and of course, I mean, I was trying to talk more in general about hospitality platforms, but still, I mean, I know all too well what you're talking about, and you perfectly centered the idea that this is a universal problem. You could have worked in any singular company in the Silicon Valley, that they most share this ethos you are writing about. And also, I wanted to know, because I was curious about this choice, but of course it makes perfect sense, and it works perfectly. Talking more about politics in a way, but I mean, or political side effect, because big tech brings other problems, and you write about it. I mean, even if they're not the main problem you are facing, but first, as a gentrification agent, a strong gentrification agent. I mean, the Google bus, all the stuff. Which kind of city is San Francisco now, under the influence of all of these rich kids who don't want to live in Palo Alto anymore, or in Sunnyvale? They want to live in Mission or in other places like that.
Well, this has been a weird year in San Francisco. So I think what the city feels like right now is not representative, but before the pandemic, San Francisco's problems are very deeply rooted. They did not originate in the tech boom. They didn't even originate in the 90s tech boom, but definitely they have been exacerbated and accelerated by the current iteration of the tech industry. And, you know, I want to be very honest about being a part of that. You know, I moved here in 2013 to work in tech. I rented an apartment for an exorbitant amount of money. You know,
Yes.
I'm part of that. And so I don't want to defend it, but I also don't want to make it a scapegoat. I think that the most notable difference to me is just who gets pushed out of the city and who comes into their place, and how a city can rearrange itself, whether that's in, you know, institutional interests or commercial enterprises, to cater to this young new money. You know, it's sort of, but I think that we're seeing this happen in cities all across the United States, where there's just this kind of flattening, homogenous effect. Um, and I think also in San Francisco, you really do have a sense that there are people whose experience of the city is mediated by software. So by delivery platforms, by ride sharing companies. And so I think that while the industry is, it's not the dominant, there aren't more people in tech than other industries in San Francisco. It's not the biggest industry here, but it has a really outsized influence. Yeah, I mean, it's a hard city. It's a really tricky city that is also beautiful and has a lot to recommend it. And I think that you can come here and have a really wonderful life without bumping up against that, but you have to you have to work for it. It's hard. It's become very hard to avoid.
Yeah, very hard to avoid. Somewhere in the book, you mentioned that the influence is big, but the in terms of workforce, the
Right.
Silicon Valley is only, you say, 10%. Am I correct?
I think that was the last, that was last I checked. I think that was right around when I moved there.
Okay.
I don't have a number for 2020, but um, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of people right now this year during the pandemic are talking about leaving. The cost of living is extremely high. Rents are extremely high. It's almost impossible to buy a property. And I I think, you know, rents have dropped like 40%
Huh.
for a 2-bedroom, and I think that we might see people return to the city who had been priced out over the past decade. But I think more likely than not, there will be a sort of decentralized version of Silicon Valley for a few years until a more familiar version of the world returns, and then people will return to the Bay Area and we'll see this all again, because the network is so important, and it can be very hard to run a fully remote workforce. But we're in a weird moment. This seems like the time where there's some opportunity. I've been talking to a lot of different people about, sorry, by that I mean, it seems like a time where there's some opportunity for things to get interesting again,
Yeah.
outside of the tech industry. I was talking to someone recently who was wondering enthusiastically if perhaps an underground might return, because historically this is a city with robust subcultures. Like, people have come here to do offbeat, interesting, creative things. So maybe we'll see a resurgence, but I'm not holding my breath. It's a weird time.
Maybe you are optimist here, but who knows? Yeah, maybe. And
Yeah.
another political side effect is the macho culture which comes with the big tech. I mean, and it's weird because, okay, the question is, how comes that San Francisco, a safe harbor for every nuance of non-binary sex type, whatever you can think about, it's so very politically correct in every respect, can also run on such rampant misogyny in this industry? How do the things go together?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I want to answer in about 50 different ways. um, I think that it has roots in the Bay Area counterculture, which, as I'm sure you know, is the sort of foundation of Silicon Valley and the sort of libertarian spirit. I think it has also kind of crystallized into this underdog mentality that a lot of people, even if they're billionaires, still feel really committed to maintaining. And I think that counterculture, though it's had these sort of values of equality and gender parity and sexual liberation, was also, riddled with racism, sexism, this kind of infiltration of external dynamics that tends to occur when you believe yourself to be recreating the rules or not having any rules. So anyway, this is a long-winded semi-answer, and there's a lot of work that's been done on this that's much better than the response I just gave, but I do think it's not unique to this moment. I think that it has a very long history. But I also think that it is tied into, questions around who gets to be considered technical, the meritocracy narrative, who is seen as an upstart and who is seen as a failure, what sorts of like individualistic stories are promoted and respected. I think that this would probably, I don't know, I guess what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand, I think there is something specific to the region that has to do with the history of the industry. And on the other hand, I also think that it is about the way labor can be gendered, and that you're likely to see, because of the sort of ethos of the industry, you're likely to see this kind of misogyny in startups in New York City as well as in San Francisco. So I don't want to overweight how important being in the Bay Area is, but I do think that the origins and the sort of spirit of the industry are very specific to the region because of that countercultural. Sorry, I'm very inarticulate about this.
No. That's very interesting in reality. Yeah, again, on the culture, the Valley is a very weird place. It's the least we can say. I mean, and you quote some typical examples of questions for jobs interview. One question could be, how many square meters of pizza consumed every year in the US? Another one could be, how many table tennis balls in a plane? Something like that. This is one part, okay? What question like this can say about the smartness of a potential hire? And this is the first part of my question on weird things. I mean, why do they make this question?
I think that the logic behind that is that it ostensibly it shows how someone thinks, how they work through a complicated problem, how they break down a system of some complexity. I actually found that in interviews, those questions were not extremely helpful, although the one that was helpful was a question we asked fairly often. How would you explain the internet to a medieval farmer?
Yeah.
And that does sort of give you a sense of how people take a very complex concept and explain it to an everyday layperson who's not particularly technical. I think the question, though, that I always found most useful, much better than how many ping pong balls fit into an Amtrak train or whatever, was just, teach me about something. And everyone has an interest that they want to talk about. And if you can get someone speaking enthusiastically about something they are knowledgeable of, then you really understand how they can communicate. But yeah, it's a really ham-fisted way of trying to understand how people puzzle through things and how they communicate. It's but it's like, it just feels, it's something that Google did. And so everyone else started doing it. And then Google stopped doing it, but everyone else kept doing it. And I don't know, maybe it's easier now, maybe it's better, but I think there's a sort of a chain reaction that happens from some of these bigger companies where the things that they do get mythologized and then they become habits.
and if I'm not wrong, you got the job because you knew how to help the fiancé of the boss for a law test or something.
Yeah, I didn't help her. They did give me a section of the standardized tests that people take to get into law school.
Law school, yeah.
And they hired me. They told me later that they hired me because I got it. It was entirely right. I think it was a perfect score on this section, which was a reading comprehension section. So I should hope that, I could do pretty well on that. But yeah, it was this, I think it ties to this impulse in Silicon Valley to quantify everything, even things that are qualitative. And so for me, I guess they wanted to know, I don't really know what that test told them about me, actually. I think it told them that I was good at taking tests. And I think that their reasoning was that if it was good enough for law school students, it was good enough for someone doing customer support at their startup. I think this is very arrogant. And also, I think not a real measurement of anyone's intelligence or capacity to do a job.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt if someone speak with you that they understand in a few minutes that you're very smart, but not because of that. I mean, of course, not because you are able to figure out how many, once again, square meters of pizza. I mean, I still don't get it, and this is part of the mythology because I tried myself to understand what was the logic behind that, but still, then there is another part which was the second half of this question. At a certain point, you write about kind of treasure hunt, a group treasure hunt with people who were taking selfies of themselves with a stripteaser somewhere. This having fun, childlike rhetoric, which is so inherent of the Silicon Valley. I mean, think about the decor of the office that every Silicon Valley mega company has. I mean, with the superpowers, the stuffy dolls and stuff like that. I mean, what is so important? Because, this is a clash of civilization here taking place. I mean, because seen from old Europe, it's really hard to understand. I've seen it hundreds of times, visiting every possible headquarter in the Silicon Valley, but still, I have a hard time to reconcile with that. I mean, the brightest people you can think of, they introduce themselves as they were kids out of high school. Well, how do you explain that?
Well, I would first say they're probably not the brightest people you can think of. They're just bright people. There are a lot of bright people. They're not all in Silicon Valley. I think a lot of these companies talk about themselves. People at Facebook will say, I work with the smartest people in the world. Yeah. And when they say something like that, you're like, oh, yeah, that's why Facebook has problems, is everyone at Facebook thinks they're the smartest people in the world. But I'm sure there are very smart people, but, everyone, I think, needs to take it down a peg. Yeah, the childlike irreverence is really bizarre. I think it has to do with a lot of different things. I mean, again, I think it's tied to this countercultural influence from the early Silicon Valley companies, where there was this idea of doing business differently, this idea that companies, private industry was the engine to change the world, but you could do it in a way that was, fun and irreverent and not, you didn't have to be a suit to do it. Yeah. I think that the playfulness is also, when you think work is fun, you're going to do more of it. It's a way to keep people at the office, to feel special, to feel like they are having a good time, not just exchanging their labor for money. I think that it's very taboo here to talk about working for money, which is crazy to me. I write about this in the book a little bit, but that's what work is. That, I think there's a real emphasis on the spiritual or the moral imperative of making this startup successful, which is really coercive language when you are an employee, especially. And also, I think, is often a cover for the other consequences of what some of these technologies can do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then there's a moment in the book where you write about those nights when they were catering food to the office in order to make you stay there even longer. And this perfectly what you're saying now. I mean, I definitely agree. It's all a mock-up. I mean, a way to disguise their true intention through a way, I mean, in a form which can be appealing. In a way, it's a gamification of work, another way to gamify work. Okay. I have a very embarrassing thing to ask you right now, because this version of Zoom lasts only 40 minutes. Can I quickly interrupt, and then you can click again on the link that I sent you?
Oh, sure.
We should just end for 1 minute, and then you click again, okay? I have to disconnect you. Okay.
Great. I'll see you in a minute.
In a minute. Here we are again. Yeah, I should convince my newspaper to buy a business version of Zoom, but they will never do it. So I mean, we have to split.
I think that's fine. You just have a coffee break. It's okay.
Okay, wonderful. Among the many other things that really changed a little bit the way I see these things now, there's another notation that you do on the weather in Northern California, in a way, and that push towards a kind of, I may say, a childlike optimism. I mean, you're right. It was so easy to forget that a person was getting old, and which role does he play? I mean, that in San Francisco almost never rains. I mean, it seems always the same eternal sunshine. In which way also these play in the ethos of the valley? I mean, you have already partially replied in a way, but still.
It's a good question. I mean, that's a fairly new weather pattern. I think that is a consequence of climate change. When I was growing up, San Francisco was like a rainy, foggy, moody city.
Yeah.
Now, every time it rains, we all say a prayer. It feels like a divine intervention, especially with all the fires that have been happening in the last few years, which have been accelerated by the drought. So I don't know that it's an intrinsic part of the tech industry, but certainly you might see it more in LA, actually.
Yeah, you're right.
But I do think there is something about the weather. I don't really have a great theory about this, but I do think that because it's hard to mark the passage of time, and I say that as someone who's from New York, so the seasons are very distinct there. San Francisco or California is not the only place where the weather is temperate year round, more or less.
Okay.
But I do think there is this feeling that time is not passing and that you're sort of in a perpetual present.
Perpetual.
But I think that this, I do think San Francisco, when I was in college, San Francisco had a reputation for being the city people went to kind of have a extended youth, Peter Pan syndrome was a phrase. And that probably has more to do with actually the cost of living here than anything else. But I do have my friend Dana Tortorici, who you've met. We've talked, she's from Los Angeles, and we've talked a bit about the way men in tech in particular kind of interact with the natural world. And she has this theory that it's because nature can't talk back. And, nature has no history to them, which of course is not true. Like the natural world has a very rich history, especially in California, or the American West. But I think there is some sort of it's a space without consequence or judgment for people who are participating in an otherwise extractive and in many ways damaging supply chain ecosystem, whatever. I mean, this is true of people who work in finance too, but I think the sort of central thought is that there's like a real psychological dynamic to the exercise culture here. But anyway, I'm in over my head on that.
No, but you know, while you were talking, it came to mind to me many years ago, 20 years ago, I wrote an unauthorized biography of Bill Gates. And at the time, I stumbled into a phrase by Paul Allen, which explained the reason why they moved from Albuquerque to Seattle. Very simply, he said, in Seattle, always rain. That's the ideal weather for programmers, for people, for coders. And while San Francisco is quite the opposite. It shouldn't be a wonderful place for programmers or computer engineers, while instead it is, despite of a much more lenient climate.
Yeah, that's funny. I feel like that's one of those things that entrepreneurs say where they're like, we moved to a rainy city because we're so serious. Everyone just needs to work all the time. But like, if you talk to a software engineer or a computer programmer, like these are just normal people. They don't want to be inside all the time. They have an appreciation for the outdoors. So I feel like that's one of those sort of mythological things that's like quite funny, but also meaningless. Ultimately.
I'm afraid you're 100% right at that. I mean, they could make a mythology out of everything. On that, on the opposite of that, it doesn't change a thing. Okay, so let's move on. Another very smart remark you make is this one. It's likely change in a term, and the term is app. App instead of application. It's not a casual transformation. It's a very smart move. I mean, can you give me other examples of manipulation of language typical of the tech industry that come to mind to you? Because the idea of not calling application, so removing the technological part from the name, it makes it sound less intimidating, less intimidating. So about manipulation of language, some other example comes to mind to you?
Sure. Yeah, the industry is really good at marketing, I think, and at obfuscation.
Yeah.
So the way that Uber and Lyft refer to their drivers as entrepreneurs,
partner,
independent, independent. I think independent workers. They have some other classification. There's that's language that masks a fairly exploitative business model, in my opinion. There is AI on the other side of that spectrum. This is something that artificial intelligence, I think that makes it sound much more sophisticated and opaque than it has to be. Right now, artificial intelligence is machine learning.
Yeah.
And there are people who can speak about how it works and what it does in very concrete ways that are very accessible to the average person. But the industry has decided to go with artificial intelligence. And I think that this makes it impenetrable to a lot of people. It seems really impressive. It doesn't have to be. I think demystification is like a moral imperative when it comes to tech. But let's see, some of the other. May
I suggest one, because that was the topic of my last but one book. Sharing economy. Sharing economy. I mean, it's total bullshit. There's no sharing between Travis Kalanick and the driver of Uber. Not so in any possible way. There's no sharing in the sharing economy. I mean, the way they have hijacked the term. I mean, because one thing is to say sharing. If you are contrary to sharing, you are selfish. Okay. Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, calling it gig economy, it's all another ballpark. No, for examples. But I mean, that was my idea. So I don't want to influence you.
No, I like that. I mean, I think this is related in some way to people not talking about the exchange of time for money. People not talking about taking a job because it pays well. You know, there's this like idea that there has to be some mission to it. In the same way, it's almost like it's taboo to say this is a marketplace and there are people who are getting exploited and there are people who are profiting greatly. And that's true of Uber, that's true of Airbnb. I'm very curious to read your book. I think that that's a fascinating space. And I'm curious, will it come out in English?
Unfortunately, I'm afraid not. I can't send you the file. You can Google Translate it in a way with DeepL, which works better than Google Translate in a way. I'm afraid no, it won't.
But you're right. You're right that sharing is one of those words.
Yeah. No, but we share many interests, and another one which leads us to the following question. It's about how insincere this new flavor of capitalism can be, no? Because among the many mantras you quote, better sorry than regret, stuff like that, no? There's one missing, one which is particularly popular at TED conferences, which is we want to make the world a better place. I mean, they keep repeating that as a religion. I mean, wouldn't it be more honest to just say we want to make a shitload of money?
I would stand up and clap someone at TED if for someone at TED if that's what they said, just for the honesty of it, not for the sentiment. Yeah, I mean, I think that rhetoric was pervasive. I mean, it's always been pervasive, but I think that has tapered off a little bit in recent years because people have made so much fun of it. But the sentiment, I think, is still very common across tech companies. And I think that the questions that are not being asked that need to be asked are make the world a better place for whom?
Yeah.
And also, what world? Like, what world does that create that people will be living in? And for me, that was sort of what was so off-putting about the optimization quantification culture, although I understand that it's very useful. It was very easy to sort of be at this data analytics company and see that the tool was useful, that it was helping people optimize their applications. But it was to take it a step further and think, okay, what are those other companies actually building? And do I believe in a world in which these are the dominant forms of communication or transaction? And I don't really know where I stand on that, but I couldn't say that I did fully believe in it. I don't feel that I should be so arrogant as to propose an entirely different economic situation or like a world economy, but the one that Silicon Valley seems to be moving toward is one that I don't feel comfortable with. And it felt very uncomfortable to be participating in that in a very, very small way. But I don't know, that's very like self-flattering. It's mostly that I think the grandiosity of that sort of mission statement is tied to, or has to do with the fact that a lot of the work itself is not that stimulating. And so you need to have an overwhelming brand narrative, because a lot of the time people are coming in and working on products that may never go live. They're working on complicated problems that they may never solve, or that might be erased and rewritten in a year. I mean this on the software side. But
it's very convincing that in order to survive, it's a psychological self-help. They do to themselves, probably. Another point toward the end of the book, rather, you chronicle an encounter with a tech entrepreneur in which you say, by and large, it's you who's talking. I was furious that they were constitutionally incapable of restraining themselves from cannibalizing music, books, subcultures, everything that made life interesting. Okay? According to you, they don't realize it, or they think they're making it better, or they do realize and they don't give a fuck about cannibalizing all of these things. Outcomes. Yeah.
I think it's a mix. I think that there is a sense of like techno-determinism,
Yeah.
the sense that this is inevitable, that because something can be done, it will be done, and therefore it should be done. I'm thinking of something like Spotify. Spotify, for me, the user, is a great product. I can listen to anything I want. You know, the offering is, it delivers on its offer, on its promise, I guess.
Yeah.
Spotify has made it incredibly hard for musicians to make money off of their work. But this is, I mean, it's not that Spotify is not single-handedly responsible for this, but it saw a hole and it exploited it. It saw a sort of hole in the social fabric and exploited it. And I think that's where I kind of feel that a lot of these companies are very cynical, because they see what's broken and what's not working in society. And instead of committing to ways to make it better, they find a way to create opportunities for themselves. And I think that this ends up, you know, avoiding the conversation of, you know, how could this not be broken in the first place? So something like Spotify has, you know, there are other sort of, I think, like nefarious dimensions to it, which is that it incentivizes musicians to create according to data, you know, like if you are trying to get the most streams of an album, like you might cater that to people's engagement metrics. You know, it just seems like but that could also be said of record sales. So I don't want to overemphasize the novelty of this. I just think that it's kind of like exploitation taken to its farthest point. But I do think that people who work at Spotify, I think they're doing a good thing. And as a consumer of that app, I think I have to agree with them on some level, right? Otherwise I wouldn't use it. But I do find that my favorite thing about Spotify is that I can see a couple friends of mine have public playlists. And it's interesting to me that the thing I love most about it is the thing that gives me the feeling that I got when people would make me mixtapes or CDs before. It's still, music to me is a personal thing. It's not just like, it's interesting. It's not just background. So I don't know. It feels so sad. It's like these digital layers built on top of these things that are part of the pleasure of living. You know, it's the pleasure of living is not to optimize your every, you know, discovery and consumption and relationship. It's it's to spend some time. But I don't know. I sound like a crank. I sound like I'm 100 years old.
No, you do not. But taking very seriously your point, because a few years ago, I don't even remember how many, but 6 or something, I came to New York to do a story about those who make the playlist of Spotify.
Oh, cool.
Guys who are in charge of creating the reggaeton or the most widely popular playlist. And I went there armed with the same intellectual mindset that you have right now, saying, you guys, I mean, a normal musician should have one billion streams in order to make a living the way you used to do it before. But then they replied to me, yes, but it's still better than before, because before there was Napster. And so it was Napster that destroyed the industry, and we are making, I mean, in a way, it's better than nothing. We are definitely much better.
Yeah. But that's like that's like one of those arguments. It's better than nothing, or like when someone says of a fascist, but he's really nice in person. You know, it's like it just feels sad that that's the point of the conversation where, you know, where we have to land. And I think Spotify is kind of an interesting example that I have not really. I feel like I tried to use it as an example just now and did so badly, but they hire a lot of musicians. They hire people away from record labels. They have people working inside the company who are music lovers, you know, who are of that former industry. And I guess for me, it's like, if that, good for them, I guess they got good jobs, but why can't those people make a living doing what they wanted to do in the first place? Like, nobody goes into public radio, or goes into being a musician, or goes into, you know, music PR because they want to work in streaming. And so what's broken that everything is being consolidated under these like few software companies that have figured out a way to basically be clearinghouses of the content form that they have chosen. So I don't know. I guess for me, it's always this battle between utility and, like, I guess some sort of sentimental attachment to the idea that people who are in creative fields should be able to make money doing the work they want to do, or should be able to if not become rich, at least support themselves with their craft. But that also has to do in the US with there being no social safety net, right? We don't have,
of course,
healthcare. We don't have a lot of public housing. So, you know, I just think that it's complicated. And I think that a lot of these companies are often criticized or praised as discrete entities, when actually they're part of a much broader social network. Sorry, that's a terrible phrase. They're part of a much
I get it. Anyway.
environment that needs to be available.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of last questions. But, about the legacy of the pandemics that we can envision, maybe. I mean, because the Great Recession, in a way, gave us the gig economy. I mean, all of those platforms was born after the Great Recession, after 2008, as a response to that. I mean, people didn't have a job anymore, or they have much smaller savings in the bank. So, I mean, also being an Uber driver would make sense. Okay. At a certain point, you imagine that you and your boyfriend could work from home, away. No one would know. Okay, you fantasize of moving far away and working from beautiful places. Do you think that this is the legacy that these pandemics, this crisis will leave us with? And don't you see risks also in the so-called work from home? Risk of self-exploitation, risk of bossware, as they call it. I mean, this software who intrudes into your...
the sort of surveillance software. I do think remote work will probably become more common, but I wouldn't say that it will be the future of the industry, because this is still an industry populated by people, and people like to be around each other, but also it can be very hard to, like, I'm just thinking of the 22-year-old who joins a company during the pandemic as a remote worker. It's very hard to move your career along if you don't know anyone in person. You miss out on the gossip with your coworkers. You miss out on picking up cues from your manager. And I think that a lot gets lost in remote work.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's a very useful option, especially for people who, for whatever reason, would prefer a more flexible schedule, whether they have dependents or children or
Yeah.
other commitments they need to tend to. I think it's a positive thing, but I do think that we will see the return of the physical office. It just might take a little while. But, you know, for better and for worse, right? Like, I also think that part of the problem in Silicon Valley is that there is, and this is not unique, this is business, this is everything, but it's a small world out here, and there are people tend to favor their social relationships in business contexts. And so I think that a fully remote workplace can actually be detrimental to a lot of people who don't have that access to a sort of inner circle in the Bay Area. So it's a mixed bag. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Patrick, your friend, the CEO, makes a very harsh reckoning in a way. I mean, he says, would it be better to have a Silicon Valley which makes only useful things? And says yes, but I'm afraid that the Silicon Valley that does genomics and the Silicon Valley that does addictive app comes from the same obsession, comes from the same auto-destructive tendency. Maybe he's right. What do you think about it? I mean, that it's the same mother of both things, or you don't agree with him?
I don't really agree. I don't think that these companies need to look or operate the way that they do. I think that the common denominator is the economic model, by which I mean obviously capitalism, but also the financial model of venture capital and the pressures that venture capital tends to assert on acceleration, speed, rapid growth, you know, growth to the point of monopoly. So I think that I just don't believe that that is inevitable. And I think that where Patrick and I might diverge is that he's a realist in that way. And I am, I think everyone, you know, I think there's potential for like a more imaginative way of living. But he's also very successful. And I would say that my tech career was not anything to write home about, anything to write a book about. So yeah, but I also think that biotech and Facebook those are two really different companies with two really different goals. And I actually wouldn't put them in the same category. So I don't know, say what you will about that. But yeah, I think he and I disagreed on that, and will continue to disagree for a long time.
Okay.
Fondly, but still.
Yeah. Disagreement noted. Last one is very quick, and the other one is the last question. The very quick is among the other weirdness of the Silicon Valley, there's this one. Why venture capitalists love universal basic income? You write about it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the short and sort of snappy answer would be it lets them off the hook.
Yes?
It lets them off the hook. It exonerates them.
Yeah.
It, you know, it's exculpatory to them. I think you know, Silicon Valley in particular is really invested in the sort of narrative of it's just the libertarian, you know, people will be successful if they apply themselves, and the best will succeed, blah blah blah. But I think that having a lot of the conversations about opportunity are not really about equality. They're about opportunity to create the conditions for that sort of
very Ayn Rand-esque.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Atlas Bound. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Very last question. I'll go on days, but this is enough. After all you've written, do you think that the Silicon Valley has reached its peak in a way now, in the current environment right now? And what will you do to overcome the critique and this new wave of resentment vis-a-vis of the Silicon Valley? Are we witnessing the peak of the Silicon Valley, or it will go on like business as usual?
I think that there are phases, there are waves of technological, developments and of fads and trends, and I think the industry will continue business as usual. I think that it might change some of the narratives about itself, and maybe that will be for the better. Like we were joking earlier, maybe companies will just say, we want to make a lot of money rather than we are going to change the world. And I would appreciate that honesty. Most other industries are honest. Tech is often compared to finance, and I think that part of why people have been so critical of Silicon Valley is that the industry has promoted itself as being better and being different. And at least people in finance will tell you that they like to make a lot of money. I appreciate the honesty. But I think that the industry is doing fine. It's very powerful. I think that we might see a change in the way it markets itself, but I do think it's here to stay. And I think it's, more pervasive than ever. What is a software company? Most companies are software companies, more or less. So what we're really talking about is branding.
Yeah. So it's here to stay. I mean, also it's enough to watch the news in which, as Main Street is going down, Wall Street is going up in an unprecedented way, and mostly because of the tech companies. So,
tech companies are benefiting hugely from this crisis.
Yeah. Huge.
But I guess I do want to add, and maybe this is where I'm too much of an optimist, but I have to believe this. I think that Silicon Valley is here to stay, but that does not mean it can't change. I just don't think that we can expect that change to come from people in positions of power in the industry. I think that change will come from the bottom up. But I am hopeful that we will see some movement in a more positive direction. And I think a lot of the worker organizing that we're seeing here is very hopeful. But I guess I don't want to despair about it, because I always think things can change. It just takes a lot of work and a lot of, and it's never going to come from the people who are benefiting. So it's complicated.
Yeah. Judging from Proposition 22, I mean, you shouldn't be that optimistic, but because they put so much money in order to get it, and they got it. $200 million in order to gain the fact that gig workers are not supposed to be employed, but private contractors and stuff, and they won it.
Yes, they won, but they won this time. But that reaction, that $200 million into a ballot proposition, that was reacting to something very powerful. You don't do that when you're not scared. That's reaction. Yeah. And they won, and that will have consequences across the country for decades, not just in California, but in the US. But they were reacting to, I think, a very powerful wave of worker organizing. That's really like the last frontier for tech workers, and contract workers. So I think there's power there, I guess. That's all. I don't know. That's stupidly optimistic.
No. I want to leave you with a further reason for optimism. Today, at the news, in TV, today's news is that a guy who works for the riders who like Deliveroo and the other platform that brings you food delivery. was a judge here in Italy, decided that he had to be reinstated as an employee. It's a first. So I mean, there's a ground to be optimistic after all. Okay,
cool.
it was a pleasure, as I suspected, and great. If I need some very minor clarification, I will send you an email just to make sure that everything is understood correctly, right?
Yes, please. Thank you. I'm around. If I can be more, I feel like that question about cultural forms is such a good question, and I didn't give you a good answer. So if you want another answer to that, let me know.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So lovely to meet you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.